So the first thing we're going to do in this example in order for us to, we want to ultimately draw a histogram, but in order to draw a histogram, we first need to have the class boundaries. So there's two bullet points above here that say to find class boundaries, subtract 0.5 from each lower class limit for the lower class boundaries, and then for upper class boundaries, add 0.5 to each upper class limit. So as an example, starting with the class boundaries for the first class, we're going to take the lower class of 150, the lower class limit of 155 and subtract 0.5, which would give us 154.5. And then we'll take the upper class limit of 190 and we add 0.5, which gives us an upper class limit of 190.5. So really the class boundaries are simply 154.5 to 190.5. Okay, that's turning into a shape, which I don't want. Okay, there we go. Continuing down, take the 191, the lower class limit, and subtract 0.5. We'll get 190.5. Take the upper class limit of 226 and add 0.5. We'll get 226.5. Yeah, I wrote that right. 226.5 to 262.5, excuse me. Because you add to the upper class limits and subtract from the lower class limit. So I'm just going to continue filling all of this out until we have all of these upper class limits. I'll take the lower class limit, subtract 0.5, subtract 1/2, and then I'll take the upper class limit and I will be adding 0.5 to get the new upper class boundary. Okay, so before we go any further, I just want to explain why we use class boundaries instead of class limits when we actually graph the histogram. And don't write this down yet because this isn't actually going to be what the histogram looks like. But let's say that we're going to start graphing this. Here's our horizontal axis. Let's say that this is 155. This is 190. Let's say this is 226. So the first class had and then let's say this is 262. So the first class had, we go up to 5 with the frequencies for these first two classes, 3, 4, 5. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a bar in for the first class, which is the 155 to 190 with a frequency of 3. So the first bar will go up to 3. And then I'm going to put a bar in for the second class, 191 to 226. And that's going to go up to 2. And then I'll put a bar in for the third class, 227 to 262, which goes up to 5. This looks kind of sketchy, but notice all my bars are touching. So the reason that we don't use these numbers and that we're instead going to use the class boundaries is because if we had a data point that was 190, say 190 was a value that we got and we're trying to figure out which rectangle, which class did 190 fall into. Well, here's 190 right here, and it is on the boundary. So it's not clear whether 190 is in the green rectangle or whether 190 is in the purple rectangle. But if I don't use 190 as one of these markers and I instead use 190.5, a class boundary, then it'll be clear whether it falls to the right of that class boundary or to the left of that class boundary. So that's just a brief explanation on why we have to go through the extra step to find class boundaries. So now that we have all the class boundaries, we are ready to start graphing our histogram. When you draw a histogram, your horizontal scale, you can either mark it with class boundaries, which is what we just talked about, using class boundaries, those 0.5 numbers, or you can mark it using class midpoints. And we'll look at an example of marking it with both. It doesn't matter which one you do. One thing I will mention is that the only thing you definitely cannot do is you cannot mark it with class limits. That would not work for the same reason that we talked about earlier. If you have a data point that falls on the boundary, it's not going to be clear which rectangle that falls into. Okay, so I'm going to start graphing my histogram down here. I'm going to make 2 histograms. I'm going to make one where I use class midpoints, and I'm going to use one where I use class boundaries. Either one would be perfectly fine, okay? But first thing I'm going to do on my histograms is I'm going to give them a title, and I'm also going to give them labels on both of the axes. So I'm going to scoot these down a little bit just to make sure that I have space to write my titles in there. So to title our histogram, let's go see what this data is about. Let's go refresh our memory. This data is for out-of-pocket prescription medical expenses in dollars. So I'm just going to go ahead and title these histograms out-of-pocket prescription medical expenses. The vertical axes for both of these histograms, and remember, they're the same histogram. I'm just doing one with boundaries and one with midpoints. But the vertical axis is going to be showing the same thing for both of these histograms. They're both going to be showing frequency. So I'm going to label my vertical axes as frequency. The frequencies look like they go as high as 7. So on both axes, I'll make sure that I'll go at least up to 7. The horizontal axes on both of these histograms is going to be showing the cost or the expense in dollars. It doesn't matter which one of those words you want to use there, cost or expense, because and this is also in dollars. I'm going to make sure to include the unit down here with that label. Now let's first work with the histogram that's going to be showing class. Let's do class boundaries first. So I'm going to break my axes, and I just mean by that the first class boundary is 154.5. So to break my axes, I'm just going to say this is just going to start. Usually people will like put a little squiggle line right there and just say, okay, I'm going to choose that right there is 154.5. And then the upper class boundary for that first class was 190.5, so I'll take that up to 190.5. And then we'll continue going down with the next class boundary. So after 190.5, we had 226.5. And I'm going to try to keep these equally about the same equal width apart. So it looks like each bar is the same width. Then we have 262.5 followed by 298.5 followed by 334.5, 370.5, and then 406.5. Okay. And now we're going to go ahead and start graphing in our bars. So for that first class, from 154.5 to 190.5, it had a frequency of 3. So I'm going to sketch in a bar that has a height of 3. And notice how that bar is starting on the lower class limit for the first class and ending on the not the upper class limit, it's starting on the lower class boundary of 154.5 and ending on the upper class boundary of 190.5. The second class had a frequency of 2, so we draw a bar in that goes to a height of 2. The third class from 226 to 262 had a frequency of 5, so this bar needs to go up to have a height of 5. That looks very crooked. Our next frequency is 6. So next we'll go up to 6. Next frequency is 7. 7 is the frequency for the class that ran from 298 to 334. Talking about this class here, had a frequency of 7. The class from 335 to 370 has a frequency of 4. So from 330, I'm saying 335 to 370, but I can see the limits are 334.5 to 370.5. That had a frequency of 4. So we'll draw in a bar that goes up to a height of 4, and then our final class had a frequency of 3. So this is what it looks like to do a histogram, and along this horizontal axis down here, we were using class boundaries. The alternative to using class boundaries is to use class midpoints. So we had already calculated the midpoints for these classes before. They're right here. I'm going to break my axes again just so I can start at the first midpoint, which is 172.5. So here's my first midpoint. And then I'll go jump to my second midpoint. The second midpoint was 208.5. That's the next mark that we'll put on here. And we'll just continue going down this horizontal axis, labeling the class midpoints. So now that I have all these class midpoints put in here, I'm ready to start drawing the bars for the histogram. The first class that had a midpoint of 172.5 had a frequency of 3. So this is where the only thing that's different here is because we chose midpoints, I want the bar to be centered at the midpoint of 172.5. So notice how this first bar right here, the 172.5, is falling directly in the middle of it because it still does have the boundaries of 154.5 and 190.5. We're just not labeling those when we do this using class midpoints. So just make sure that if you use midpoints and you're doing it by hand, that you're centering the bar around the midpoint. Next class goes up to 2. Next class went up to 5, followed by 6, followed by 7. And this isn't perfectly spaced, but the good news is that for the most part, we won't be making we won't be making histograms by hand. For the most part, we will be using technology to make our histograms, and that's what we're going to look at next. So now we're actually going to make our histogram on StatCrunch. Hopefully you already still have your frequency distribution pulled up. So I'm just right now copying and pasting. I just copied the data from the note sheet, and now I'm just pasting it into StatCrunch. I think I had put cost up here before. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go to graph, even if you don't have your frequency distribution still up. But I'm going to go to graph and I'm going to click on histogram. I want to make a histogram for my cost, so I'm going to select cost. I'm going to start at 155. That was our minimum data value. And remember, our class width was 36. So I'm going to choose 36 there. I'm going to make sure to give my x-axis a label. I'm going to label my x-axis cost, and I'm also going to label my y-axis frequency, which is not spelled correctly. And then I'm also going to title this, what was this, out of pocket medical expenses. I'll leave the title as that. And then I'm going to click compute down here. I'm going to click compute, and this is what we see. Now let's take this histogram and let us compare it with the histograms that we formed. Now, one thing about StatCrunch is it's not showing us class boundaries or class midpoints. But if we were creating one by hand, we would make sure to put boundaries or midpoints so that it would be clear what falls into what. So we can see that the general shape of this does match the same shape that we found there. We can see it goes 3, 2, 5, 6, 7, 4, 3. I'm just counting the frequencies and they're matching up with what we have. And so there's a lab assignment coming up soon there where you'll be asked to create some frequency distributions, and that is how you will create them in StatCrunch.